Miss, it's time for us to dance. The statement, soft but clear, sliced through the murmur of the charity gala. The music from the string quartet faltered. 100 conversations died in an instant. Every eye in the opulent ballroom belonging to bankers, surgeons, and philanthropists snapped to the source. There, beside the grand oak doors, stood a black janitor in blue overalls over a gray t-shirt, his warm brown hand outstretched. His invitation was not for the debutantes in their silk gowns or the society wives dripping in diamonds. It was for the little girl sitting silently in a state-of-the-art wheelchair. Grace Ashton, 11 years old, whose legs hadn't moved in the year since the accident. Her face, framed by a cascade of dark hair, was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and confusion. A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman whispered, "How cruel!" Then a voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold as ice. "What did you just say to my daughter?" Penelope Ashton, CEO of Ashton Industries, moved from her table with a predatory grace. Her designer gown shimmered, but her eyes held a fire that could melt steel. She stopped directly in front of the janitor, her fury a palpable force. The janitor, a black single dad who looked weary from a life of hard work, didn't shrink back. He held her gaze, his own eyes filled with a strange, unnerving calm. His deep brown skin, his tired shoulders, his calloused hands, all of it looked wrong in this world of crystal chandeliers and old money, like a man who had stepped out of the service corridors and refused to go back. He looked past the powerful CEO, back to the girl frozen in her chair. "I said," he repeated, his voice gentle but firm, ignoring the collective horror of the room, "it's time for us to dance." The words hung in the air, an act of defiance so audacious it bordered on insanity. For a split second, Penelope was speechless, caught between disbelief and a rage so pure it threatened to consume her. This man, this nobody in a stained uniform, had not only violated the sanctity of her event, but had targeted her daughter, the one part of her life that was fragile, broken, and off limits to the world. Security. Penelope's voice was no longer a sharp command. It was a roar. Two men in black suits materialized from the edges of the ballroom, their faces grim. "Get this man out of my sight, now!" The janitor, Marcus Cole, didn't resist. He lowered his hand and gave Grace one last lingering look. Not of pity, but of something else, something that looked dangerously like understanding. As the guards gripped his arms, his dark brown hands hanging loose at his sides, he turned his head and met Penelope's furious glare. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any apology. It was a challenge. The guards practically lifted him off his feet, marching him toward the service exit. The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of whispers. Penelope's perfectly curated evening had been shattered. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, but inside a storm was raging. Humiliation was an emotion she hadn't felt in a decade, and she hated it. She turned back to her daughter. Grace was staring at the empty space where the janitor had stood, her small hands clutching the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes, usually vacant with a quiet sorrow, were now wide with an unreadable emotion. "Grace, honey, are you all right?" Penelope knelt beside the chair, her voice softening, but the steel remained just beneath the surface. Grace didn't answer. She just kept staring as if the man had left a ghost behind. "Let's go home," Penelope said, her decision final. She gestured to Grace's private nurse, a stern woman named Helen, who immediately began maneuvering the wheelchair toward a side exit, away from the prying eyes of the guests. The drive back to the sprawling Ashton estate was a study in silence. Penelope sat in the back of the Maybach, staring out at the blurred city lights, her jaw clenched. She had already made a mental note to have her head of security not only confirm the janitor's termination, but also ensure he was blacklisted from every major venue in the city. He would never work again. But as the initial wave of rage began to recede, something else crept in. A cold, nagging question. Why? Why would a man risk his livelihood for such a bizarre, cruel stunt? He hadn't seemed drunk or mentally unstable. He had been calm, deliberate. His eyes, they hadn't held malice. They had held an unnerving certainty. It was the look of a man who knew something she didn't. She glanced at Grace in the seat across from her. Her daughter was still lost in her own world, tracing patterns on the leather seat with her fingertip. The accident a year ago had stolen more than her ability to walk. It had stolen her voice, her laughter, her light. Doctors from around the world had offered diagnoses, conversion disorder, post-traumatic paralysis, but no one had offered a cure. They had all looked at Grace with sympathy, with pity. The janitor hadn't. Back at the mansion, Penelope watched as the nurse put a silent Grace to bed. She stood in the doorway of her daughter's cavernous room, a space filled with untouched toys and expensive physical therapy equipment that served only as monuments to their failure. The hope she had fiercely guarded for months had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember. Later that night, unable to sleep, she paced the length of her home office. The polished marble floors felt as cold as the knot in her stomach. The incident replayed in her mind over and over. "Little miss, it's time for us to dance." The sheer insane confidence of it, the way he had looked right through her, the powerful CEO, and spoken directly to her daughter as if she were the only person in the room who mattered. It was madness. But what if it wasn't? The thought was a traitor slipping through the fortress of her anger. For a year, she had listened to the best medical minds in the world. She had followed every protocol, funded every experimental treatment, and for a year, nothing had changed. Her daughter remained trapped in silence and stillness. This janitor, in the space of 30 seconds, had elicited a stronger reaction from Grace than any doctor had in months. She had seen it in her daughter's eyes, not just shock, but a flicker of what? Recognition, fear, hope. Penelope stopped her pacing and walked to her desk. She pressed the intercom button that connected directly to the head of her personal security team, a man who owed his entire career to her. "Davis," she said, her voice low and steady, "the janitor from the gala tonight, the one who was removed." "He's been dealt with, Miss Ashton," Davis's voice crackled back. "He won't be a problem." "That's not what I'm calling about," Penelope said, her gaze drifting to a framed photo of a smiling, walking Grace, taken just weeks before the accident. "I want you to find out who he is. I don't mean his name and address, I mean everything. His past, his employment history, where he went to school, who his family is. I want to know where he was born and what he had for breakfast this morning. I want to know why he was there tonight. Find out everything you can about him." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Miss Ashton, may I ask why?" Penelope's voice was barely a whisper. "Because I need to know if he's a monster or if he's the only person in the world who wasn't afraid to look my daughter in the eye." 2 days passed. For Penelope Ashton, they were the longest 48 hours of her life. She moved through her corporate duties like an automaton, chairing meetings and signing multi-million-dollar contracts with a detached efficiency that unnerved her subordinates. But behind the mask of the unshakable CEO, her mind was a whirlwind, constantly circling back to the janitor's calm, challenging eyes. While Penelope wrestled with her uncertainty, Marcus Cole's life continued in its quiet, predictable rhythm. His world was a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a part of the city Penelope's limousine service probably had marked as a no-go zone. The building smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood, a universe away from the antiseptic, gardenia-scented air of the Ashton estate. For a black man like Marcus, this side of the city was familiar, the kind of place where no one looked twice at a janitor coming home after a double shift. On Saturday morning, Marcus sat at a small, wobbly kitchen table, carefully helping his 9-year-old daughter, Amara, glue a feather onto a shoebox diorama. Amara was a miniature version of him, with the same thoughtful eyes, deep brown skin, and a halo of tight curls that bounced when she laughed, and a smile that could disarm a battalion. "Do you think Mr. Henderson will like the T-Rex nest, Dad?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concentration as she positioned a plastic dinosaur. "He'll love it," Marcus said, his voice warm and gentle. "You even gave the baby T-Rex a little feather mohawk. That's extra credit for scientific accuracy right there." Amara giggled. "You're silly." "Only on weekends," he replied with a wink. His hands, which had pushed a janitorial cart through miles of sterile hallways, were surprisingly nimble. His dark brown fingers moved with a quiet purpose. Whether he was fixing a leaky faucet or braiding Amara's hair, there was a stillness about him, a deep well of patience that seemed at odds with the weary lines etched around his eyes. He had built a small, safe world for his daughter, a fortress of love and routine, designed to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. He never spoke of his old life, of the woman who had given Amara her smile, or of the career that had once defined him. To Amara, he was just Dad, the man who made the best pancakes, told the best bedtime stories, and could fix anything. He had been fired, of course. The call had come the morning after the gala. It was expected. A black janitor stepping out of line in a room full of billionaires didn't get second chances. He had crossed a line, and in Penelope Ashton's world, lines were absolute. He hadn't fought it. He just started looking for a new job, another anonymous position where he could blend into the background. But even as he scanned the want ads, his thoughts kept drifting to the girl in the wheelchair. He could still see her eyes, wide and haunted, and the almost imperceptible tremor he had spotted in her calf muscle just before he'd spoken. It was a flicker of life, a signal in the dark that only a man trained to look for such things would ever see. Meanwhile, in a sleek glass-walled office downtown, Davis, Penelope's head of security, placed a single thin file on her desk. His face was impassive, but his posture was tight. "This is everything we could find on Marcus Cole," he said. Penelope leaned forward, her fingers steepled. "And on the surface, he's exactly what he appears to be," Davis began, his tone professional. "Single father. Daughter is Amara Cole, age 9. He's worked janitorial and maintenance jobs for the last 5 years. No criminal record. Pays his bills on time, lives quietly. By all accounts, a model citizen." Penelope's eyes narrowed. "That's not everything, Davis. I can hear the but in your voice." Davis took a slow breath. "But before these last 5 years, it's like he was a different person. He doesn't just have a past, Miss Ashton. He has a history that he buried." He slid the file across the polished mahogany desk. Penelope opened it. The first page was a standard background check summary. The second page, however, contained a grainy printout of an article from a medical journal dated 6 years prior. The headline read, "The Cole Method, Dr. Marcus Cole's Revolutionary Approach to Neurorehabilitation." Beside it was a picture of a younger Marcus, a black man dressed in a doctor's white coat, his expression confident and brilliant. He looked like a man who could command a room, not clean it. Penelope's breath caught in her throat. She read on, her eyes scanning the text with increasing speed. The article detailed his work as a celebrated neurophysiotherapist, a prodigy in the field of functional neurological disorders. He had made a name for himself treating patients with unexplained paralysis, seizures, and motor tics. Patients the rest of the medical community had written off as psychological cases. He was described as a visionary, a miracle worker. She flipped the page. There were more articles, awards, conference invitations. He had been a star, a beacon of hope for people trapped in their own bodies. And then 5 years ago, it all just stopped. "What happened?" Penelope whispered, looking up at Davis. 5 years ago, his wife, a neuroscientist named Dr. Nina Cole, was killed in a multi-car pileup, Davis said quietly. "According to our sources, he was driving the car behind her. He saw the whole thing. 2 weeks later, he resigned from his position at the Institute, sold his house, and vanished from the medical community. He's been working menial jobs ever since." Penelope stared at the photograph, at the ghost of the man who had offered to dance with her daughter. It didn't make sense. A man with that kind of talent, that kind of knowledge. Why throw it all away to push a mop? And more importantly, what had he seen in Grace? The file gave her the what, but it didn't give her the why. His incredible past didn't explain his bizarre actions at the gala. In fact, it made them even more baffling. A doctor of his caliber would know better than to subject a traumatized child to that kind of public spectacle. It was reckless, unprofessional. Unless it wasn't. The mystery, which had been a nagging question, now became a consuming obsession. She closed the file, the silence in her office pressing in on her. She had the facts, but she didn't have the truth, and she realized with a jolt that there was only one person who could give it to her. "Davis," she said, her voice firm, the voice of a CEO making a decision. "Get me his address and tell my driver to have the car ready in 10 minutes. The Maybach glided to a silent stop on a street that looked like it had been forgotten by the rest of the city. The buildings were brick and tired, their fire escapes tracing jagged lines against a bruised twilight sky. For Penelope Ashton, it was like arriving on another planet. Her driver, a man trained for discretion in the face of billion-dollar deals and scandalous affairs, couldn't hide the flicker of concern in his eyes as she stepped out of the car. Penelope ignored him. She smoothed down her tailored cashmere coat, a piece of clothing that cost more than the combined rent of the entire floor she was about to visit, and walked toward the entrance of the building. The lobby smelled of damp concrete and bleach. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, her heels clicking an alien rhythm on the worn linoleum until she found apartment 3B. She stood before the door for a long moment, her heart pounding a nervous, unfamiliar beat. She was Penelope Ashton. She did not get nervous. She made people nervous. But the man on the other side of this door had already dismantled her composure once. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound was sharp, decisive, a command. The door opened a moment later. Marcus Cole stood there, his expression unreadable. He had changed out of his work overalls and was wearing a simple Henley shirt and jeans. His warm brown skin caught the dim hallway light, and there was a quiet steadiness in his dark eyes. He wasn't surprised to see her. His eyes held a quiet resignation, as if he'd been expecting this visit all along. Before he could speak, a small face peeked around his leg. It was Amara, holding a half-eaten apple, her tight curls pulled into a crooked puff, her curious eyes wide as she took in the imposing woman standing in their hallway. "Dad, who's that?" she whispered. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her head. "It's okay, sweetie. It's someone from my old job. Why don't you go finish your homework?" Amara nodded, and after one last inquisitive look at Penelope, disappeared back into the apartment. Marcus's gaze returned to Penelope, his expression hardening slightly. "I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish by coming here, Miss Ashton." "I'm not here for an apology," Penelope said, her voice clipped and precise. She held up the manila file. "I'm here for an explanation. I know who you are, Dr. Cole. I know what you used to do. So you're going to tell me right now why you subjected my daughter to that performance." Marcus looked at the file, then back at her. A flicker of pain crossed his face, a shadow of the man he used to be. He sighed, a weary sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, and stepped back, holding the door open. "You should come in." The apartment was small, but it was meticulously clean and surprisingly warm. Children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. A stack of library books sat on a small end table. On one wall, a framed photo of a beautiful black family, Marcus, Nina, and a much younger Amara, smiled out at the room. It was a home filled with a quiet love that felt more real than any of the curated, sterile spaces in her own mansion. Penelope remained standing, her posture rigid. "I'm not here for tea, Dr. Cole. I'm here for answers. I'm not a doctor anymore," he said quietly, closing the door. "And I didn't do anything to your daughter. I did it for her." He finally met her gaze directly, and the unnerving certainty was back. "I saw her muscle fire." The words were so simple, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. Penelope felt her breath catch. "What are you talking about?" "Your daughter," Marcus said, his voice low and intense. "When you walked past her table at the gala, your gown brushed against her leg, and her calf muscle, the gastrocnemius, had an involuntary tremor, a fasciculation. It was tiny, less than a second, but it was there. I saw it." He walked over to a small bookshelf and pulled down a heavy medical textbook. "The doctors have told you her paralysis is real, and they're right, but they're looking for the cause in her spine. They're looking for nerve damage, for a physical disconnection. They're not going to find it because the problem isn't in her body, Miss Ashton. It's in her brain." He opened the book to a chapter on functional neurological disorder. "Trauma can rewire a person," he explained, his voice taking on the quiet authority of the expert he once was. "When the mind experiences something it can't process, it sometimes chooses to protect itself. It severs the connection to a part of the body. It builds a wall. The nerves are fine. The muscles are healthy, but the brain has forgotten how to command them. Your daughter is living inside a psychological prison. That flicker I saw, that was a sign that the prisoner is still alive in there, rattling the bars." Penelope stared at him, her carefully constructed world beginning to tilt on its axis. "And the dance? Why would you humiliate her like that?" "It wasn't about humiliation," he said firmly. "It was a pattern interrupt, a shock to the system. For a year, everyone has treated her like she's made of glass. They speak in whispers. They handle her with pity. Her brain has accepted that as the reality. I had to do something so unexpected, so far outside the realm of her daily experience, that it might bypass the conscious mind and provoke a reaction. I needed to see if I could make the prisoner rattle the bars again on command." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I didn't expect her to stand up. I just wanted to see her flinch, to see that flicker again, to prove that the connection is still there, just dormant." It all clicked into place. The confidence, the certainty, the complete disregard for the consequences. He wasn't a madman. He was a doctor performing the most unorthodox diagnostic test of his life. And it was for her daughter. The revelation didn't come like a gentle sunrise. It came like a crack of lightning, shattering the dam of grief, frustration, and fear that Penelope had been holding back for a year. The thought that Grace's condition wasn't a life sentence, that the daughter she remembered might not be lost forever, was too much to bear. A choked sob escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth, but it was too late. The iron control that had defined her entire life crumbled into dust. The formidable CEO of Ashton Industries stood in a black janitor's cramped living room and began to weep. The tears weren't quiet or dignified. They were raw, agonizing sobs, torn from a place of profound pain and a terrifying, fragile new hope. Marcus stood frozen, a medical textbook still open in his hands. The sound of Penelope's raw, unrestrained sobs filled the small apartment, a sound so out of place it felt like a violation. For 5 years, he had meticulously avoided this exact kind of raw, unfiltered pain. He had built his new life on a foundation of emotional distance, of simple problems that could be solved with a wrench or a mop. This was a wound he had no tools to fix. Not anymore. He was no longer a doctor. He was just a man, a black single dad, trying to keep his own world from collapsing, completely unequipped to handle the emotional collapse of one of the most powerful women in the world. He awkwardly took a step back, his instinct to comfort clashing with his deep-seated need to flee. The curtain to the hallway rustled and Amara peeked out, her eyes wide with concern. She had heard the crying. Her gaze flickered from Penelope's shaking form to her father's face, a silent question in her eyes. Marcus gave her a tiny, reassuring shake of his head, and she obediently disappeared again. But the moment hung in the air. He was a father first. That was his only job now. Finally, Penelope's sobs subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, her movements clumsy, her perfect composure utterly annihilated. She looked up at him, her face blotchy, her mascara smeared, and for the first time, he didn't see a CEO. He saw a terrified mother. "Can you help her?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper, stripped of all its authority. Can you fix her?" The question was a punch to the gut. It was the same question he had been asked 100 times in his old life. The question he had run away from. He closed the textbook with a soft thud and placed it back on the shelf, the gesture a clear and deliberate boundary. "Miss Ashton," he began, his own voice quiet but firm, "I'm a janitor. The man you're looking for, the doctor in that file, he doesn't exist anymore. He died 5 years ago on the interstate right alongside his wife." The words were harsh, but he needed her to understand. He couldn't offer a hope he wasn't sure he could deliver on. "I don't believe that," Penelope said, pushing herself to stand, gathering the tattered remnants of her strength. "A man with your knowledge doesn't just forget it. It's a part of you." "Knowledge isn't the issue," Marcus countered, his jaw tight. "I left that world for a reason. I won't go back." "Why?" she pressed, stepping closer. "Because it's painful for you? My daughter has been trapped in a wheelchair for a year, unable to speak, unable to live. And you're worried about your own comfort." The accusation stung, but he didn't flinch. "I am worried about my daughter," he said, his gaze flicking toward the hallway where Amara was. "I am worried about giving you a hope that turns out to be false. I know what that kind of failure does to a family. I will not be responsible for breaking yours a second time." "You are the only hope I have." Penelope's voice cracked, her desperation palpable. "I will give you anything. Name a price. I'll fund a private research lab for you. I'll build you a state-of-the-art clinic. I will write a check so large it would make international news. Just please help my little girl." He shook his head, a sad final motion. "My life is not for sale, Miss Ashton, and your daughter's healing isn't something that can be bought." He turned away from her. "I think you should go." It was a dismissal, clear, final. The conversation was over. Penelope stood in the middle of the room, defeated. The flicker of hope that had ignited within her was about to be extinguished. She looked around the small apartment at the simple, loving life he had built, the worn couch, the taped-up drawings, the photo of a black family laughing in the sun, and she understood his refusal. He had found a sort of peace here, a quiet harbor after a devastating storm. She was asking him to sail back into the hurricane. She turned to leave, her shoulders slumped, but as her hand reached the doorknob, the curtain rustled again. This time, Amara stepped out. She was holding the shoebox diorama of the T-Rex nest. She walked hesitantly toward Penelope, her small face serious. "Are you sad because your daughter is sick?" Amara asked, her voice as clear as a bell. Penelope froze, looking down at the little girl. She couldn't speak, so she just nodded, a fresh wave of tears threatening to fall. Amara held up the diorama. "My dad fixes things," she said with the simple, unwavering faith of a child. "He fixed my bike and Mr. Henderson's leaky roof. He's really good at it. Maybe he can fix your daughter too." Marcus closed his eyes, his heart aching. "Amara, honey, it's not that simple." "Why not?" Amara looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "You always say that when people are hurt, you should help if you can." Out of the mouths of babes. The simple, profound truth of it cut through all of Marcus's defenses. It was the core principle he had built his life on, the very creed he had taught his daughter, and he was about to betray it. He looked at Penelope's tear-streaked face, at the raw plea in her eyes. He saw the ghost of every desperate parent who had ever sat in his office, And then he looked at Amara, who believed her father was a hero who could fix anything. How could he tell her he was a coward? A long, heavy silence filled the room. Marcus took a deep, shaky breath, the sound of his own carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I'll do it," he said, the words tasting like rust and regret in his mouth. "I'll try to help your daughter." Relief washed over Penelope's face so intensely it almost brought her to her knees. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." "But not for your money," Marcus said, his voice instantly regaining a sliver of its old authority. He was setting the terms now. This would be on his ground. This is not an employer-employee relationship. I am not on your payroll, and we don't do this in a hospital or some sterile room in your mansion. I need a neutral space, a place where Grace can feel safe, not like a patient being studied. Penelope nodded quickly, willing to agree to anything. "Whatever you need. We have a guest house on the estate. It's separate from the main house. Quiet. It has everything you could need. Would that work?" Marcus considered it. It was a compromise, but it offered control and privacy. "Fine," he said. "You'll arrange for my things to be moved. My daughter and I will stay there, but my methods are my own. You don't interfere. You don't question me in front of Grace. You just trust me. Can you do that?" For a woman who trusted no one, it was the biggest ask of all. She looked from his determined face to his daughter's hopeful one, and she knew she had no other choice. "Yes," Penelope said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can do that." Moving from their cramped apartment to the Ashton guest house felt like stepping through a portal into another dimension. The guest house wasn't a house. It was a modern architectural marvel of glass and stone nestled discreetly among a grove of ancient oak trees. It had 3 bedrooms, a chef's kitchen with appliances that hummed with silent efficiency, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a serene private garden. Amara was mesmerized. She ran from room to room, her footsteps silent on the heated marble floors, her face pressed against the glass as she watched a hummingbird hover over a fuchsia bush. "Dad, it's like a spaceship," she declared, her voice filled with awe. Marcus watched her, a tight knot of apprehension in his chest. This world of effortless luxury was a gilded cage, and as a black man who had spent his life on the service side of places like this, he worried it would change her, or worse, that she would grow to love it, and he would eventually have to tear her away from it. He unpacked their few boxes of belongings, Amara's well-loved stuffed animals, his worn paperbacks, the framed photo of Nina, and tried to carve out a small corner of home in this opulent, impersonal space. The next morning, he met Grace for the first time since the gala. Penelope brought her to the guest house, pushing the high-tech wheelchair along the stone path. Grace was even smaller and more fragile than he remembered. Her dark hair was neatly brushed. Her clothes were impeccably clean, but her eyes were vacant, fixed on some distant point beyond the manicured lawns. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't acknowledge anything. "Grace, sweetie," Penelope began, her voice strained with forced cheerfulness. "This is Mr. Cole, and this is his daughter, Amara. We're all going to be spending some time together." Grace remained silent, her expression unchanging. Amara, however, stepped forward, her natural curiosity overriding any shyness. She held out her T-Rex diorama. "Hi," she said. "I'm Amara. Do you like dinosaurs?" Grace didn't respond. Her gaze didn't even flicker. Penelope's hopeful expression faltered. She doesn't really talk, Amara. Not for a while now." "Oh," Amara said, undeterred. She placed the diorama gently on Grace's lap. "That's okay. You can just look at it. The little one has a feather mohawk." For the first time, Grace's eyes shifted, dropping down to the shoebox in her lap. Her brow furrowed in a faint, fleeting expression of something. Curiosity, confusion. It was gone in an instant, but Marcus saw it. It was another flicker, another signal from the prisoner in the tower. "Thank you, Amara," Marcus said gently. "Why don't you show Grace the garden?" Penelope looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. "Alone? I don't think." "Trust me," Marcus said, his voice low and firm, reminding her of the terms. Reluctantly, Penelope let go of the wheelchair. Amara, taking this as her cue, began pushing Grace along the path, chattering away about the different types of flowers and how one of them looked like a grumpy old man. Marcus and Penelope watched them go, 2 worlds colliding in the form of their daughters. "What's your plan?" Penelope asked, her arms crossed, her anxiety radiating off her in waves. "What's the first step?" "The first step is for her to not see me as a doctor," Marcus replied, never taking his eyes off the girls, "or you as a worried mother, and Amara as a visitor. The first step is for this to feel normal, routine. She needs to lower her defenses. Her brain built a fortress to protect her from a threat. We can't storm the walls. We have to convince the guard to open the gate willingly. For the next week, that's exactly what they did. Marcus established a gentle routine. In the mornings, he and Amara would have breakfast in the guest house. Then Amara would go and get Grace. They would spend time in the garden or in the sun-drenched living room of the guest house. Amara would read to her, draw pictures, or just sit beside her in comfortable silence. Marcus never initiated therapy. He simply existed in the space, a calm, non-threatening presence. He'd work on fixing a squeaky hinge on a door or read a book in a nearby armchair. His dark brown hands might be tightening a screw instead of a mop handle, but to Grace, he was just there, steady and quiet. He was just Marcus, Amara's dad. Penelope struggled. Her entire being screamed for action, for metrics, for a progress report. It was agony for her to sit in the main house, watching from a distance, forbidden from interfering. She saw her daughter being pushed around by a 9-year-old and a janitor doing odd jobs nearby, and it felt like nothing was happening. But she had made a promise. Then, on a warm Thursday afternoon, a sleek black convertible purred up the driveway. A man unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a perfectly tailored suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Julian Thorne, Penelope's ex-husband. He strode toward the guest house as if he owned it. Marcus, who was weeding a flower bed, stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral. Julian's eyes swept over him, a look of casual dismissal. "I doubt it. I'm here to see my daughter." He paused, as if that should explain everything. "I'm Julian Thorne." He said the name like it was a key that opened any door. Just then, Penelope came rushing out of the main house. "Julian, what are you doing here? You were supposed to call." "I did," he said smoothly, pecking her on the cheek, a gesture that was both intimate and performative. "You didn't answer. I was worried. I wanted to see my little girl." His gaze fell on Marcus again. "And who is this? The new gardener?" "This is Marcus Cole," Penelope said, her voice tight. "He's a friend. He and his daughter are staying here for a while." Julian's smile widened, but it was edged with steel. He walked over to where Grace sat in her wheelchair, Amara standing protectively beside her. He knelt down, taking Grace's limp hand in his. "Hello, my darling," he cooed, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Daddy's here. Did you miss me?" Grace, as usual, gave no response, but Marcus saw it. A subtle tensing in her shoulders. Her fingers resting on the armrest curled ever so slightly. It was the first time he had seen a reaction from her that wasn't a muscle twitch. It was a response to a specific person. Julian looked up at Penelope, his expression shifting to one of grave concern. "She seems worse, Penny, more distant. Are you sure this is the right environment for her? With strangers?" His eyes flicked to Marcus and Amara. "We're fine, Julian," Penelope said coldly. "Of course," he said, standing up and brushing off his trousers. He gave Marcus one last long look, a silent assessment that was both a challenge and a threat. "Well, I just wanted to stop by. I'll see you soon, my angel." He blew a kiss to Grace and strode back to his car, the engine roaring to life before he sped away. The air felt thick and heavy in his absence. Marcus walked over to Grace's wheelchair. He knelt down in front of her, just as Julian had. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his voice soft. "It's okay to be scared, Grace," he whispered. "But you're safe here." For the first time since he had met her, Grace Ashton lifted her head and her eyes met his. They were filled with a profound, terrifying, and unmistakable emotion. Fear. The single word hung in the air between them, more potent than any scream. Fear. It was a raw, primal signal from the depths of Grace's locked-away mind, and it was directed squarely at him. Marcus didn't move, didn't even breathe. He held her gaze, acknowledging her terror, letting her know he saw it, truly saw it. For the first time, for a full 10 seconds, the world seemed to shrink to the space between the broken little girl and the man who had promised she was safe. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the connection broke. Grace's eyes went vacant again, the light within them extinguished. She slumped back in her chair, her head lolling slightly to the side, returning to the empty shell she had been just moments before. But the air had changed. A door had been opened, and now they all knew what lay on the other side. Penelope rushed forward, her face pale with a mixture of horror and a terrible dawning understanding. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Marcus, what just happened?" "She was looking right at you. She was terrified." "No," Marcus said, finally standing up, his own heart pounding. He turned to face Penelope, his expression grim but energized. The passive observer was gone. The therapist was back. "She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of him, of Julian." "That's impossible," Penelope said, shaking her head in denial. "She loves her father. He adores her. Julian, he can be difficult, but he would never, ever hurt Grace. Pain isn't always physical, Marcus said, his voice low and firm. That reaction was pure instinctual fear. It's the key, Penelope. The reason her mind built the fortress in the first place. Her trauma, whatever it is connected to him. He looked over at Grace, who was now staring blankly at the garden as if the last minute had never happened. The passive phase is over, Marcus stated. Waiting for her to open the gate isn't enough. We have to give her the tools to pick the lock herself. He turned and walked back into the guest house, his movements now filled with a purpose Penelope hadn't seen before. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed Grace's wheelchair and followed him inside, Amara trailing silently behind them. The living room, which had been a quiet, neutral space, was about to become his office. He cleared the sleek glass coffee table, pushing aside a stack of art books. "What are you going to do?" Penelope asked, her voice laced with apprehension. Her brain has shut down the pathways for speech and motor control because the memory is too dangerous to let out that way, Marcus explained, his focus absolute. So we need to open a new pathway, one that feels safer. He disappeared into one of the spare bedrooms and returned with several large pads of drawing paper and a box of charcoal pencils he'd had moved from his apartment. "We're going to let her hands do the talking." He pulled a chair up to the coffee table and set out a single sheet of paper and one thick stick of charcoal. Then he turned to Amara. "Sweetie, can you do something for me?" he asked gently. "Can you sit with Grace? You don't have to do anything, just be with her." Amara nodded, pulling a small stool up beside Grace's wheelchair. She didn't try to talk to her. She just sat, a small, reassuring presence. Marcus knelt in front of Grace again, bringing himself to her eye level. "Grace," he said softly, his voice a calm, steady anchor. "I know you're scared, and I know you can hear me. I'm not going to ask you to talk. I'm not going to ask you to move. I'm just going to ask you to listen to a story." He didn't look at Penelope, but he could feel her holding her breath a few feet away. "Once upon a time," Marcus began, "there was a little bird who loved to fly. She would soar so high the world looked like a tiny map below her. But one day a terrible storm came. The wind was so strong, and the thunder was so loud that the little bird got scared. She flew into a cave to hide, and she stayed there for a very, very long time. It was safe in the cave, but it was also dark, and the little bird started to forget what the sun felt like. She started to forget how to fly." He paused, letting the words settle. "She's still in there, Grace. The part of you that knows how to fly. She's just hiding. And that's okay, but I think she's tired of the dark." He gently took Grace's limp hand and curled her fingers around the thick piece of charcoal. Her muscles were unresponsive, her hand like a doll's. He carefully rested her hand on the clean white paper. "You don't have to come out of the cave," he whispered. "Just show me what it looks like in there." He let go of her hand. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. Grace's hand rested on the page, motionless. Penelope let out a shaky breath, the sound of her hope beginning to fray. It was too soon. It wasn't working. But then Amara reached out and gently placed her own small hand over Grace's. "It's okay," she murmured, so quietly only Grace could hear. "You can draw a dinosaur if you want. They're good at hiding." And then it happened. Grace's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the charcoal. Her hand began to move, dragging across the paper. It wasn't a drawing. It wasn't a shape. It was a single, jagged black line, pressed so hard into the page that the paper tore, a violent, angry scar across the white emptiness. She stopped. Her hand fell open, the charcoal stick rolling away. Her body went slack again, but the line remained. Marcus stared at it, his heart hammering in his chest. It was a start. It was communication. It was rage and fear given form. Penelope let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. It was the most her daughter had done in a year. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep in their separate rooms, Penelope found Marcus sitting alone in the dark garden, staring up at the stars. The tension from the afternoon had settled into a heavy, thoughtful silence. "Julian called me," she said, her voice quiet. She stood a few feet away from him, unwilling to break the fragile peace. "He asked how Grace was doing. He asked about you. He said he was worried I was putting my daughter in the care of an unstable man." Marcus didn't turn. "What did he say?" "He knows about your wife," Penelope said softly. "He said he read the accident report. He said you were driving. He suggested that your guilt might be clouding your judgment, that you might be trying to save my daughter to make up for the fact that you couldn't save your own wife." The cruelty of the words was breathtaking. Marcus's shoulders tensed, the only sign the blow had landed. He remained silent for a long time. "Is it true?" Penelope finally asked, the question costing her everything. Marcus finally turned to look at her. his face a mask of old, deep-seated pain in the moonlight. "Yes," he said, his voice gravelly. "It's true. I was driving." He looked away again. "But that's not why he's trying to get rid of me. He's not worried about my past. He's worried about what Grace is going to draw next." Penelope stared at him, the cool night air suddenly feeling thin and sharp in her lungs. The words hung between them, heavy with insinuation. He's worried about what Grace is going to draw next. It was an accusation so monstrous, so contrary to everything she knew about Julian, that her mind recoiled. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That Julian is afraid of a child's drawings. That's absurd." "Is it?" Marcus's gaze was unflinching. "A year of the best medical care in the world, and no one finds a single physical reason for her condition. Then the moment we open a nonverbal pathway for her to communicate, her father shows up and does everything in his power to discredit me and shut this down. He's not attacking my methods, Penelope. He's attacking the possibility that they might work." He stood up and began to pace the small stone patio, his earlier weariness replaced by a sharp, analytical energy. Functional neurological disorder is a prison, but it's a prison the mind builds for a reason. It's a coping mechanism. The brain decides that the memory of the trauma is so catastrophic, so existentially threatening, that it's safer to shut down the body than to relive it. Grace isn't paralyzed because her legs don't work. She's paralyzed because her mind won't let them. He stopped and faced her. "Whatever she's hiding in that cave isn't just a storm, it's a monster. And I think your ex-husband knows exactly what that monster looks like." Penelope sank onto a stone bench, her head spinning. Julian was selfish, manipulative, and had been a terrible husband. But he was Grace's father. She had seen him read bedtime stories, build sandcastles, push her on the swings. The image of him as a monster, as a man who would intentionally harm his own daughter or be afraid of her healing, was a reality she couldn't reconcile. After the accident, she said, thinking aloud, "He was devastated. He was the one who held my hand in the hospital. He was the one who cried when the doctors told us she might never walk again." "Was he?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or was he playing a part? You told me he was a master of public perception. Is it possible he was just managing the narrative even then?" The question was a seed of doubt, planted in the fertile ground of her own long-suppressed misgivings about the man she had once loved. She didn't have an answer. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill cutting through her expensive cashmere sweater. The next few days were a tense, fragile dance. The drawing sessions continued, but Grace was more withdrawn than ever. Julian's visit had been a stone thrown into a still pond, and the ripples of fear had sent her retreating deeper into her silence. She would sit at the table, charcoal in hand, but the page remained blank. Marcus didn't push. He sat with her, sometimes telling his story about the little bird, sometimes just being a quiet, steady presence. Amara would sit nearby, building elaborate castles out of blocks. Her cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the heavy silence. Penelope watched, her heart a tangled knot of hope and dread. Every blank page felt like a victory for Julian. The attack came on a Tuesday morning. Penelope was in a board meeting at Ashton Industries, a high-stakes negotiation with a Japanese tech firm, when her phone buzzed with an urgent summons from her personal lawyer. She excused herself, a cold premonition washing over her. "What is it, Robert?" she asked, stepping into her private office. "It's Julian," her lawyer said, his voice grave. "He's filed a motion for an emergency custody hearing. He's petitioning the court to have Grace removed from your care." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. "On what grounds? That's insane." "He's claiming you've fallen under the influence of an unlicensed and unstable individual," Robert explained, and she could hear the rustle of papers. "He's citing a Dr. Marcus Cole, claiming his unorthodox methods are causing Grace further psychological distress. He's attached the police report from his wife's accident, Penelope. He's painting a picture of a man consumed by guilt, using your daughter as a dangerous experiment to assuage his own demons. He is requesting a court-appointed psychiatrist to evaluate Grace and a restraining order against Marcus." It was a brilliant, vicious checkmate. Julian wasn't just trying to remove Marcus. He was trying to use Marcus to prove Penelope was an unfit mother, the very clause that would give him control of Grace's trust fund. Her mind raced. Robert was already advising her to cut ties, to issue a public statement, to distance herself from Marcus immediately. It was the logical, strategic move, the safe move. It was the move the old Penelope Ashton would have made without a second thought. But as she stood there looking out over the city she had conquered, all she could see was the single jagged black line Grace had drawn on that piece of paper. It was the only real communication she'd had from her daughter in a year, and Marcus was the one who had made it possible. "Robert," she said, her voice like ice, "cancel my afternoon and file a counter motion. We're not just fighting this, we're going to bury him." She hung up before he could argue. When she arrived back at the guest house, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the stone path, she found Marcus and the girls in the living room. Another blank piece of paper sat on the table. Marcus looked up as she entered, saw the storm in her eyes, and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Julian filed a motion, she said, her voice tight with fury. "He's trying to take Grace away. He's trying to get a restraining order against you." Marcus's face went pale. This was it. The nightmare he had run from, the public dissection of his worst failure, was about to happen all over again. A black man with a complicated past was an easy target in a system that already doubted him. "You should listen to your lawyers, Penelope," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "You should fire me. It's the only way to protect yourself and Grace." "No," she said, walking to the table and standing behind her daughter's wheelchair. She placed her hands on Grace's shoulders, a gesture that was both protective and defiant. "I'm not running from this, and neither are you. He thinks he can scare us. He thinks he can break us apart. We are going to prove him wrong." Marcus looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw past the CEO, past the wall of ice, and saw the ferocity of a mother fighting for her child. He saw a woman who was choosing to stand by him, a black janitor with a ruined career against the world. In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something rarer. It was trust. He nodded slowly. "All right." He turned back to Grace, his resolve hardened. "All right, Grace, the world is getting loud again, so we need to be louder." He took a fresh sheet of paper and placed it in front of her. He put the charcoal in her hand, but this time he also took out a small, smooth gray stone from his pocket, one he'd picked up from the garden path. He placed it on the table. "This is your cave," he said softly. "It's safe, but the walls are starting to crack. The light is getting in. You don't have to fly out. Just show me one of the cracks." Amara, sensing the shift in energy, came over. She picked up the stone and placed it gently in Grace's other hand, closing her small fingers around it. "You can hold this," she whispered. "It makes you strong." Grace sat there, the stone in one hand, the charcoal in the other. Her eyes were fixed on the blank page. The room was silent, filled with a fragile collective hope. Then her hand moved, slowly, shakily. It dragged the charcoal across the page. It wasn't a violent, angry line this time. It was deliberate. It was a shape, a circle. And inside the circle, another smaller circle, and radiating out from it, a series of crooked, spidery lines. It was a steering wheel, broken, twisted. A memory, fragmented but undeniable, finally breaking through the darkness. The broken steering wheel lay on the page like a piece of wreckage salvaged from the depths. It was more than a drawing. It was a testament, a crack in the wall of silence. Penelope stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She could almost feel the cold, twisted metal, almost hear the echo of the crash. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of despair. It was a tear of fierce, defiant hope. Marcus remained kneeling, his eyes locked on the charcoal image. He didn't celebrate, he didn't praise. He knew this was the most delicate moment yet. The little bird had poked her head out of the cave, and the slightest wrong move would send her scrambling back into the darkness for good. "Good," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur. "That's a good start, Grace. You're showing me the storm." He gently nudged the paper a few inches to the left. "What else? What else was there?" Grace's hand, which had fallen limp, twitched. Her fingers curled and uncurled. Amara, still holding Grace's other hand, gave it a gentle squeeze of encouragement. The room was so quiet Penelope could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Slowly, Grace's hand rose again. Her movements were robotic, her eyes still distant, as if another part of her was in control. She brought the charcoal to a different part of the page and began to draw again. This time the lines were straighter, more frantic. She drew a rectangle and then a spiderweb of cracks spreading across it from a single point of impact, a shattered windshield. Penelope let out an involuntary gasp. She remembered that image with horrifying clarity from the moment she regained consciousness in the car, the world outside fractured into 1,000 pieces. Grace wasn't done. Her hand moved below the windshield, sketching a smaller, simpler shape. Another rectangle with a small circle on it. Penelope frowned, confused. "What is that?" she whispered. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He recognized the shape instantly. It was the universal symbol of a modern trauma, the last thing so many people see. "It's a phone," he said, his voice grim. "She's drawing a phone." As if the act of drawing it had finally exhausted her, Grace's hand dropped. Her whole body seemed to deflate, and she slumped in her chair, her breathing shallow. Amara looked up at her father, her eyes wide with concern. "Is she okay?" "She's okay, sweetie," Marcus reassured her, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "She's just tired. She did a lot of hard work today." He looked at Penelope. "The hearing is in 3 days. This isn't enough." Penelope's newfound hope faltered. "What do you mean? This is everything." "She's communicating, Marcus. She's showing us what happened. She's showing us the setting, not the story," he countered, his tone urgent. "A broken steering wheel and a cracked windshield are consistent with any car accident. Julian's lawyers will tear this apart. They'll say it proves nothing. We need the monster, Penelope. We need her to draw what she's so afraid of." Before she could reply, his phone, lying on a side table, buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read. "I know what you're doing. You think you can save her? You couldn't even save your own wife. Stay away from my family." Marcus's blood ran cold. It was Julian. He had gotten his number. It was a direct threat, a calculated, cruel strike at his deepest wound. He quickly deleted the message, his hand trembling slightly. He couldn't let Penelope see it. He couldn't let her see how much it had shaken him. "You're right," he said, forcing the steadiness back into his voice. "We need more, and we are running out of time." That night, a chilling formal email arrived from Julian's legal team, officially serving them notice of the hearing. The date and time were set. Friday morning, 72 hours. The email also contained a new, sickening attachment, a signed affidavit from a renowned child psychiatrist, Dr. Alastair Finch, who, without ever having met Grace, stated that based on his review of the case file, the unconventional therapy being administered could be causing irreversible psychological fragmentation. "He bought an expert," Penelope said, her voice filled with venom as she stared at her laptop screen in the main house's study. Marcus stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. "This is what he does. He uses money and influence to create a reality that suits him." "Then we have to create a reality he can't deny," Marcus said. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than she had ever seen them. The anonymous text message burned in his mind. "You couldn't even save your own wife." Julian was right. How could he possibly save this child when he was still so broken himself? Penelope must have seen the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She closed the laptop with a decisive snap and turned to face him. The study was dark, lit only by a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across the room. "He got to you today, didn't he?" she asked softly. Marcus didn't deny it. He just nodded, looking away. "He knows where to hit. My lawyers told me to cut you loose," she said, her voice dropping. "They said you were a liability, that your past made us vulnerable." She took a step closer, closing the space between them. "They're wrong. Your past isn't your weakness, Marcus. It's why you're the only person on earth who can do this. You understand pain. You're not afraid of it. That's why you can see my daughter when no one else can." He looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a client, not a CEO, but a terrified mother who was placing her entire world in his hands. He saw the trust in her eyes, a trust he felt he hadn't earned, a trust he was terrified of betraying. "I don't know if I can get her there in time, Penelope," he confessed, the admission costing him dearly. "You won't be doing it alone," she said. She reached out, not with the hesitant uncertainty of before, but with a new, quiet strength, and placed her hand on his arm. Against his brown skin, her pale fingers looked like a promise and a risk all at once. Her touch was warm, a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness. "We will do this together." He looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. The air between them was charged with the intensity of their shared battle, with the unspoken understanding of two broken people trying to make something whole again. He took a deep breath, his resolve returning. "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow we go back in. But we need a key, something to unlock the door, a sensory trigger." Was there a particular song playing in the car, a specific sound? Penelope's mind flashed back, and a detail long buried under the trauma surfaced. "The radio," she whispered. It was off. But Grace, she had her music player. She was listening to a song over and over, a piano lullaby. Marcus nodded, his eyes alight with a new strategy. "Find it," he said, his voice now firm, the therapist back in command. "Find that song. Tomorrow we're not just going to ask her to show us the storm. We're going to make her hear it." The next morning, the air in the guest house was thick with unspoken tension. 48 hours. The countdown had begun, and every ticking second felt like a grain of sand slipping through their fingers. Penelope had found the song. After hours of searching through Grace's old digital playlists, she'd located a file simply titled Sleep. It was a hauntingly simple piano lullaby, a delicate melody that seemed to rise and fall like a gentle breath. She played it for Marcus in the kitchen, the quiet notes filling the space between them. It was beautiful, and, knowing its context, utterly terrifying. "This is it," she confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. She listened to this every night. It was her comfort. "Today it's going to be our key," Marcus said, his face grim. The session began not with paper and charcoal, but with quiet preparation. Amara, sensing the gravity of the moment, didn't chatter. She simply took Grace's hand and held it, a silent, steadfast anchor. Penelope positioned a small Bluetooth speaker on the corner of the table. Marcus knelt in front of Grace, his expression gentle but his eyes serious. "Grace," he said softly, "we're going to listen to some music today, a song you know. I want you to just listen, and if you feel like it, if the bird feels brave enough, I want you to show me what you hear." He nodded to Penelope. She took a deep breath and pressed play. The first few notes of the lullaby drifted into the room. For a long moment, nothing happened. Grace remained still, her expression as vacant as ever. The melody continued, its simple, repetitive pattern weaving a delicate web of sound. Then it began. A tremor ran through Grace's hand. Her fingers, resting limp on the arm of her wheelchair, suddenly clenched into a tight fist. Her breathing, usually shallow and even, hitched. A low, guttural whimper escaped her lips, a sound of pure, primal fear. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the wall, darted around the room as if searching for an escape. The lullaby was no longer a comfort. It was the soundtrack to a nightmare. "Stay with us, Grace," Marcus murmured, his voice a steady anchor in her rising panic. "You're safe. Just show us." He slid the charcoal into her trembling hand. The contact seemed to ground her. Her terrified gaze locked onto the blank page, and her hand began to move. It wasn't the slow, hesitant movement from before. This was a frantic, desperate scrawl. The charcoal carved deep, angry lines into the paper. She drew the car again, the steering wheel, the shattered windshield. The images poured out of her, a torrent of visual memory unleashed by the music. But then she drew something new. A figure. A man standing outside the driver's side door. He was holding the phone she had drawn before, holding it up as if filming the wreckage. His back was to her. The piano notes continued their relentless, gentle march. Grace's breathing grew more ragged. She drew a second figure, this one inside the car, slumped unconscious over the broken steering wheel. It was Penelope. A strangled sob escaped Grace's throat as she drew her mother's limp form. "Who is it, Grace?" Marcus pressed gently. "Who is the man outside the car?" Her hand moved to the figure as if to draw a face, but she couldn't. The trauma was too immense. Instead, her hand flew across the page, scribbling violently over the man's body, obscuring him in a storm of black charcoal. But through the chaos, details emerged. The sharp collar of the overcoat he had been wearing, the expensive gleam of his watch. Then her hand stopped its frantic scribbling. It became chillingly deliberate. She drew the man, reaching back into the shattered car, not to check on Penelope, not to help his daughter. He was reaching for the glove compartment. His hand emerged, holding a slim, rectangular shape. A file. The memory was complete. The monster was revealed. The lullaby reached its final soft note and faded into silence. The instant the music stopped, Grace broke. A piercing shriek tore from her throat, and she dropped the charcoal as if it had burned her. Her entire body began to shake in a violent, uncontrollable tremor. It wasn't a seizure. It was a full-blown panic attack. A year's worth of suppressed terror finally erupting. "It's okay. You're okay," Penelope cried, rushing forward. But Marcus put a hand out to stop her. "Let me," he said, his voice a calm command. He knelt in front of the shaking child, making sure she could see his face. "Grace, look at me. Breathe with me, in and out. You're not in the car. You're here in the guest house. Amara is holding your hand. Your mom is right behind me. You are safe." He continued to talk her down, his deep, even voice a steady, rhythmic presence guiding her out of the storm. Penelope knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter's flailing hand, murmuring, "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're so brave." Slowly, painstakingly, the tremors subsided. Grace's frantic gasps softened into exhausted sobs. Her eyes, which had been wide with horror, fluttered closed. She was asleep, her body finally surrendering to the utter exhaustion of reliving its darkest moment. Amara, who had been silent and strong throughout the ordeal, finally let out a small, shaky breath. "Is she going to be okay now, Daddy?" Marcus gently brushed the hair from Grace's damp forehead. "Yes, sweetie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she is. After they had carefully moved Grace to the sofa, covering her with a soft blanket, Marcus and Penelope stood over the table, staring at the final drawing. It was a chaotic, terrifying masterpiece of a child's trauma, but it was also a story, a coherent, horrifying narrative. The car, the unconscious mother, and the father, Julien, ignoring his family to film the scene and steal a file from the glove compartment. "My God," Penelope whispered, her hand covering her mouth. The merger. There was a hostile takeover bid. The files Julien needed to prove insider trading were in that glove compartment. I was taking them to my lawyer. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a sickening realization. He didn't cause the crash, but he saw it as an opportunity. He left us there. He thought I was dead, and he took the file to save himself. This was the memory. This was the act of betrayal so profound it had severed the connection between Grace's mind and her body. They had it, the truth. The monster captured in charcoal. Marcus looked from the drawing to Penelope's pale, determined face. "We have it," he said, his voice low. "But the hearing is in 2 days. Is a drawing, a story told by a traumatized child, going to be enough to stop him?" The judge's chambers felt small and suffocating, the polished mahogany walls seeming to absorb all the air in the room. It was the morning of the hearing, the final hour. 24 hours. Penelope sat beside her lawyer, Robert, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. Across the table, Julien sat, looking the part of the aggrieved, concerned father, his expression a perfect mask of sorrowful duty. His lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, had already presented Dr. Finch's damning affidavit. Marcus was not allowed in the chambers. As the subject of the restraining order, he waited in the sterile hallway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Amara sat beside him, her small hand tucked into his, a silent, comforting presence. "Mr. Thorne, the judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, began. Your motion is extraordinary. You claim that Miss Ashton's choice of caregiver for her daughter is not only negligent, but actively harmful." "Your Honor," Julien said, his voice smooth and laced with pain, "this is the last thing I ever wanted. But I cannot stand by and watch my daughter, who has already suffered so much, be subjected to the dangerous fantasies of a disgraced man. Penelope is not well. She's clinging to false hope, and this man, this janitor, is exploiting her grief. He publicly humiliated my daughter at a gala, and now he is filling her head with these dark, twisted ideas." He sounded utterly convincing. Robert, Penelope's lawyer, shifted nervously. He had Grace's drawings in his briefcase, but he knew how they would look to a skeptical judge, the frantic scribbles of a traumatized child. "Miss Ashton," Judge Miller said, turning to her. "Your response?" Penelope took a breath, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the emotion Julien was performing so expertly. "Your Honor, for 1 year my daughter has been trapped in silence. For 1 year the finest doctors in the country have told me there is nothing physically wrong with her, yet she could not move. In the last 2 weeks, Marcus Cole has given my daughter something no one else could, a voice. It is not his fault that the story she has to tell is one her father does not want anyone to hear." Robert placed the final drawing on the table, the broken car, the unconscious mother, the shadowy figure of Julien stealing a file. Julien's lawyer laughed, a short, derisive sound. "Your Honor, are we seriously accepting a child's nightmare doodles as evidence? This is precisely the psychological fragmentation Dr. Finch warned about." The judge stared at the drawing, her expression unreadable. The moment stretched, thin and fragile. The weight of the entire case seemed to rest on that single piece of paper. Penelope felt a surge of despair. It wasn't enough. Marcus had been right. Then she remembered the phone, the detail Marcus had seen. She leaned over and whispered urgently in Robert's ear. His eyes widened slightly and he nodded. "Mr. Thorne," Robert said, his voice suddenly sharp, "could you please describe for the court your actions in the moments immediately following the car accident?" Julien didn't miss a beat. "Of course," he said, his voice cracking with feigned emotion. It was chaos. I checked on Penelope, then I immediately tried to comfort Grace. I called 911. My only thought was of my family. "You called 911 from your cell phone?" Robert pressed. "Yes, immediately." Robert opened his briefcase and produced a new document, placing it on the table with a firm thud. "These are your cell phone records from that day, Mr. Thorne, subpoenaed this morning. They show a significant data upload consistent with a video file at 11:14 a.m., the moment of the crash. They also show a call made at 11:16 a.m., not to 911, but to your financial advisor. There is no record of a call to emergency services at all." Julien's mask of grief faltered. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes. That's That's not right. The records must be wrong. At that exact moment, a soft knock came at the chamber door. A bailiff entered and whispered something to the judge. Judge Miller's eyebrows shot up. "Let them in," she commanded. The heavy door swung open, and there stood Grace. She was on her feet. Her legs trembled violently, but she was standing. Her left hand gripped a metal walker, her right hand held tightly by Amara. She was pale and looked fragile as glass, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that had been extinguished for a year. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Penelope's hands flew to her mouth, a sob of pure, unadulterated joy catching in her throat. Julian stared, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The monster had escaped the cave. Grace took a slow, shuffling step into the room, then another. She stopped in the center of the floor, her gaze locking onto her father. And then she spoke. Her voice was a hoarse, rusty whisper, the sound of a key turning in a lock that hadn't been used in a year. But it was clear. "You left us," she said. Julian recoiled as if struck. "The papers," Grace whispered, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed at him. "You took the papers and you ran." It was over. The lie, the performance, the entire vicious charade shattered by the two things Julian Thorne never counted on. The resilience of his daughter and the quiet observation of a black janitor who refused to look away. 6 months later, the world was a different color. The gray pall of fear and uncertainty had been replaced by the bright, vibrant hues of a new beginning. Julian was gone, entangled in a web of legal battles that would consume the rest of his life. The custody motion had been summarily dismissed, and a criminal investigation into his actions had been launched. Grace was not just walking, she was dancing. Every afternoon, the guest house, now Marcus and Amara's permanent home, filled with music. She was still in therapy, but now it was about finding joy in movement, not just function. The silence had been replaced by laughter, her own and Amara's, which had become the constant, happy soundtrack of the estate. One warm autumn evening, Marcus and Penelope sat on the patio, watching the two girls chase fireflies in the sprawling garden. Grace moved with a new, confident ease, her laughter ringing through the twilight air. Amara's tight curls bounced as she ran, her deep brown hands cupped around flickering lights like she was catching stars. "I never thought I'd hear that sound again," Penelope said softly, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder. "She's strong," Marcus replied, his arm wrapped around her. "Stronger than any of us." They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear. The frantic battle was over, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. They had built a family not on a foundation of perfection, but on the shared, messy, beautiful process of healing. "Marcus," Penelope said, turning to look at him. Her eyes, which had once been so guarded, were open and full of a light he had come to love. "I don't want you to be the man in the guest house anymore." He smiled, his heart full. "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached into his pocket, but there was no ring. He hadn't needed one. Their life together had already been forged. "Marry me, Penelope." "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Their wedding was a small, simple affair held in the garden where the girls loved to play. Penelope wore a simple cream dress, and Marcus wore a suit that felt strange and new on his broad shoulders. Grace and Amara were their bridesmaids, dropping rose petals on the grass aisle. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the small gathering, Marcus stood with his new wife, watching their daughters dance together on the lawn. Grace twirled, a picture of pure, unburdened joy. Amara spun beside her, curls flying, their hands linked as they laughed. He looked at Penelope, her hand in his, and he finally understood. He hadn't just helped save Grace. They had all, in their own way, saved each other. They had faced the monster in the darkness and walked out into the light. Together, the janitor, the CEO, and their two brave daughters, a black father, a once untouchable mother, and the girls who pulled them all forward. A family whole and healed, ready for their next dance.